Welcome, everybody. You are at Fairfax EggBank's webinar, Expanded Panel Genetic Testing, How to Select Your Egg Donor. Let me introduce you to your speakers today. I'm Suzanne Seitz. I'm a certified genetic counselor, and I've been practicing for about 30 years. And I've been with donor egg banks for over 15 years. And we'll be joined by Teri Reaves, the Director of Client Relations, to talk about the process of selecting and reserving a cohort of eggs. If you have questions during the webinar, as you go along, you can enter those into the webinar panel, and we will have about a 30-minute Q&A session at the end. And we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as possible. And if we can't get to them all today, we will be doing a follow-up blog with some of those questions. And all those who are registered today will be getting a copy of the recording of this webinar that you can reference. So let's go over our goals today. We want to go over what it means to be a carrier. We want to explain the standard genetic testing performed on the Fairfax EggBank donors. We want to go over this step-by-step process of how to find a donor on our search using this genetic testing information, and also what it means to find that good match. We'll also go over the steps in selecting and securing an egg donor once we find that ideal egg donor who's a good match for us. And then we'll get to your questions at the end. We have a quick poll. I just wanted to see, before we start getting into some of this genetics information, how comfortable you are with the expanded genetic carrier testing. So you can answer not familiar at all, you're a newbie, I know a little bit, I know a lot, or I'm an expert. So go ahead and click one of those buttons, one of those four, and we'll see how our audience balances out. What's our spread there?
So we've got 31, not familiar at all. 64%, I know a little. 3%, I know a lot, and 2%, I'm an expert.
All right, I know a little is our crowd, so that's awesome. So I'll be really talking basic information. That's awesome. So let's talk about our expanded genetic carrier testing program here at Fairfax EggBank. Since about 2018, Fairfax EggBank has been testing all our new donors with an expanded panel, and that panel includes 283 genetic conditions. Genetic tests are constantly improving, and we always are looking to add additional conditions as they become available. Not only have the number of conditions increased, the testing methodology, which is now gene sequencing, is much better. It has a better detection rate, and it lowers the risk for us to be a carrier with a negative result. It is important to remember that if an individual tests negative by gene sequencing for a specific genetic condition, the risk is lowered significantly to be a carrier. But genetic testing can't get us to zero risk, but it can get us very close. So this is the basics from your Biology 101 class. The expanded panels are looking for recessive conditions. Healthy carriers are those who carry one copy of a variant or mutated gene. Our genes occur in pairs. One we've inherited from our biological mother, the other from our biological father. Carriers with only one copy of the mutated gene are generally healthy, have no symptoms, do not have the condition. The normal copy of the gene compensates for the mutated one, hence we're healthy. Why does this carrier testing matter? Knowing what conditions we're a carrier for before pregnancy can give us that valuable information that we need to reduce the risk for our future children. For those with autosomal recessive conditions, which means they're not on the sex chromosomes, only when both biological parents are carriers for the same condition or gene is the child actually at increased risk. And you'll see in the drawing here that the risk is 1 in 4, or 25%, for an affected child if both biological parents are carriers for the exact same condition. If a child inherits both copies of the mutated gene, one from each parent, they can no longer compensate because they don't have a normal gene present anymore. Therefore, they'll have the disease. It's rare for you and your partner both to be carriers of the same disease, but that is what we're looking for here. Most people who actually find out that they're carriers on this genetic testing are completely surprised. They've never heard of the condition. They tell me there's no family history, and that's the most common thing I hear. There's no family history, but that's actually what we would expect. So we are also on our egg donors. Let's go back to the, there we go, genetic carrier testing for recessive diseases. Now I'm looking at X-linked conditions. This is another type of recessive disease, and it's inherited on the X chromosome. Our X and our Y chromosomes determine our genetic sex. So genetic males have an X and a Y, and a genetic female has two X's. If a genetic female has two X's, and if she's a carrier for an X-linked recessive condition, she's healthy. Again, she has that second X to compensate, but she has the ability to pass on that X chromosome with the mutation to her sons. And half of her sons will show the condition, will be affected, and half of her sons will not. It doesn't matter what the biological father gives in this type of inheritance. And for this reason, we will exclude any egg donor who we are screening who tests positive for an X-linked recessive condition on our panel. You may have heard of Fragile X condition. That's a common form of X-linked inherited disease, and we do exclude our egg donors who are Fragile X carriers. We'll often see in a family history of an X-linked disorder that the woman who's a carrier will have affected brothers or affected maternal uncles. Again, it's traveling through the maternal line of the family. And these are also things that we evaluate when we're doing the family history review on our egg donors. So if anyone has an expanded panel testing done, an egg donor or anyone in the general population, about 70% of us right now will come out as a carrier for at least one condition. You could be a carrier for more than one condition. That I've seen that happen as well. And actually, as the testing improves and more conditions are added to future panels, this will likely approach 100%. We are all believed to be carriers of a handful of genetic conditions. If you remember from the Human Genome Project, there are about 20,000 genes that make up a human being, and we can only test for a few hundred of those conditions right now. So you can see how we're slowly approach 100% of us being identified as carriers. The important thing to remember is when it comes to evaluating risks, it only matters if the biological parents are carriers for the same condition. And that doesn't happen very often, probably 1% or less of the time. But when it does, that risk is 25% for an affected child. And this is the situation we're trying to avoid. So testing helps us address these questions of risks and helps us make those informed choices. Luckily, when you use an egg donor, you have some flexibility in your choice, so we can find a good match for you moving forward. How do we reduce risks? Well, our goal for any healthy pregnancy is to reduce risks as much as possible. Genetic testing is one of the tools we use to do that. If genetic testing identifies a risk, we need to make sure you understand that risk is addressed before we move forward to create embryos. It can take some time to get all the important questions answered and get to a place where everyone feels comfortable moving forward. So genetic testing does offer us a means to get to that place. But we have to be patient for those results to come in. If a sperm source is a carrier for a genetic condition, then the recommendation is to have the egg donor, in this case, tested and be negative. The same in reverse. If the egg donor is a carrier, we should consider testing the sperm source for that condition. To be clear, testing never gets us to 0% risk, but it can get us close. Even the best genetic testing today can't get us to 0% risk of being a carrier. Let's go over the possible situations where genetic testing is an important consideration. If your sperm source has been tested and is a carrier for a genetic condition, and you are ready to look for an egg donor, then you can consider looking for an egg donor already tested negative for that same condition. In the egg donor database, there is an option to filter by a criteria, which includes the ability to look for those donors with the expanded panels. That's called GenPanel Plus, and you'll see the icon of the double helix there indicates that. If you click on that filter, it will show you the donors that have all had the expanded panel done. And you can review the donor profile to see what she's been tested positive for, if that's the case. As you recall, 70% of these egg donors will be a carrier, but 30% of the egg donors that are tested with the expanded panel are actually negative for all conditions tested. So let's take a look at what a profile would look like for a GenPanel Plus donor. So here's an example. So a GenPanel Plus donor has the banner at the top that says added bonus. This donor has expanded genetic testing. You'll see that double helix icon. And then you'll notice in the donor number, this donor number is 9198 IDC. So she has a C at the very end of her ID number, and that C indicates that she's a carrier. If there's no C on a GenPanel Plus donor, that means that she's not an identified carrier. Okay, so let's take a look at what a medical profile would look like for this particular donor. So now we want to find out what she's a carrier for. We can do that by going to the medical profile, expanding that out, and at the top of the genetics section, the tests are listed. It'll give the date it was tested, the name of the condition, and the gene name as well. So here she's a carrier for specific condition, and that becomes a critical thing that you want to look for in that sperm source testing when you're comparing the genetic tests next to each other. Some labs will actually list condition names differently, but the common denominator will always be the gene name. So that interesting combination of letters and numbers that are capitalized, that's the gene name, and that is the common denominator. So if you happen to have a sperm source that is tested by a different laboratory, that's a good way to make that comparison. And that's something that a genetic counselor does, that your clinician can do, and can certainly help facilitate making sure that's a good match for you. Okay. And here is another possible scenario. If your sperm source has not had expanded carrier testing, the process of choosing a donor is a bit different. You may first want to look at all, I mean, you can certainly look at all the donors. More donors is better. But if you want to look at donors that have no C in their number, that's a good place to likely find a donor that you can use right away. This will include both the GenPanel Plus donors that have tested all negative, as well as donors that were tested before we started the expanded panel. But if you find a donor that's a carrier that you like, it's an easy process to encourage that additional testing that needs to be done to make the match suitable. When your sperm source has already had expanded panel testing done, this is the ideal scenario, because now you really have all the options available to you with very few barriers. You can really move forward very quickly. In this instance, you look at all donors. It's very possible that your sperm source is a carrier for something. We would make sure that the egg donor is tested negative, and in reverse as well. And I know a lot of the IVF clinics and the clinics where Fairfax EggBank collaborates, this expanded panel testing is becoming the norm. But it is always good to get that information before you start looking for a donor, if at all possible. Now that we reviewed the basics of the expanded panel testing and how it can be used to select a donor, let's go over the process of selecting an egg donor through Fairfax EggBank. You have now made a choice of that ideal donor that you like, and if she happens to be a carrier, the first step is to receive and review documents that pertain to the testing results of that donor. So I'm going to go over one group of documents that's available. It's certainly available to the clinics as they're making the matches, but information that's available to you on request, and that is our genetic testing summary. The other document is called Genetic Risk Acknowledgement, and Teri will be going over that because that is part of that process of reserving the cohort. But it's a lot of that information will go along with what you've already learned today. So let's go over the genetic testing summary. So there's a face sheet, a front sheet that has the donor number, and it will list for you a summary of everything that the donors had done. The first thing there is the chromosome testing, normal 46XX. Every single egg donor in our program, regardless of whether they've had the expanded panel tested or not, have had a chromosome analysis done, and it's been normal. Now, chromosomes are the whole structure. The genes sit on chromosomes like beads on a string. We're looking at the whole chromosome structure. We want to make sure it's all there, that it hasn't been rearranged, and that there isn't any abnormality there that could predispose to pregnancy loss or bad outcomes. So the chromosome analysis being normal is absolutely a must for all of our donors in the program. We also do a hemoglobin evaluation. That's a test that's been done for decades on donors. It looks at blood parameters, looks at things in the genetics world like sickle cell trait and thalassemia trait. Then we include cystic fibrosis, spinal muscular atrophy, and Fragile X. These are 3 of the conditions that are recommended by the medical and genetic societies be tested on all women who are considering pregnancy. So we've included those up front because we know that that's something that is just a standard of care across the board. On the very bottom row, you'll see the expanded panel testing. There are 3 boxes there, and let me go over succinctly what each of those boxes means. So on the far left column, you'll see that expanded panel testing was done and how many diseases were tested and the testing methodology. In this case, it's gene sequencing. The middle block will give you a result. And in this case, I've chosen a donor who's a carrier for Tay-Sachs disease. It'll give the name of the condition, the gene name, and that's the parentheses HEXA. So the gene for Tay-Sachs disease is HEXA. And then it will also indicate what the other results were. And in her case, negative for all other genes sequenced. And then the final column will give information about what our recommendations are. And in this case, it's sperm source testing is indicated before using this donor. And that's going to be the standard recommendation if we find that the donor is a carrier. Okay, and so beyond that face sheet, behind it will be the actual expanded panel testing results. And this is typically a document that runs anywhere from 12 to 15 pages long. And the front page will give a summary of the diseases for which she's a carrier, but more importantly, it can also give information about the condition, about the specific variant that was found, and it will also give you a complete list of all the genes that were tested on that donor and were found to be negative. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that that list of genes in this particular case is listed alphabetically by gene name. Other labs will do it alphabetically by condition name. And just to note, labs do have different diseases on their panels. So you can have a 274, a 283, a 175. So just having an expanded panel does not mean you all are being tested identically unless you're tested at the same lab. So it is important for us to do that careful comparison. We use Semaphore, which is the lab that we've used since we started doing the expanded panel, and we've been very pleased with them. But if your clinic is affiliated with a different laboratory, we can certainly work with you to compare genes and conditions to make sure that things have been tested appropriately. Okay, so at this point, I need to turn this over to Teri Reaves, who's going to talk about the next series of steps that we go to in order to finalize our choice.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Suzanne. Can everyone hear me just fine? I'm assuming so. All right. So again, my name is Teri Reaves. I'm the Director of Client Relations here at Fairfax EggBank. And to continue the process, the next step would be a consultation with your IVF clinic. Fairfax EggBank is affiliated with more than 300 IVF clinics across the United States and the world. And your relationship with your IVF clinic is critical in this process. We do recommend that after you've had your full consultation and evaluation, that you do add to the conversation a discussion about genetics to determine whether or not the donor that you would like to select is a suitable match. Many clinics have genetic counselors available that you can consult and will let you know how to proceed when choosing a donor that is a carrier of a known genetic condition. If your clinic does not have a genetic counselor, Fairfax EggBank's genetic team will be happy to evaluate the results of expanded genetic testing and provide these recommendations. Now the fun part, reserving that cohort. So when you're ready to reserve a donor egg cohort, there are absolute benefits to working with Fairfax EggBank, and here are the next steps. In addition to reserving your cohort, some of the benefits with working with Fairfax EggBank is that we do have one of the most expansive repositories of frozen donor egg in the United States. The client relations team will work closely to help you to identify that ideal donor, and that selection process is very personal, and we will help you every step along the way. In addition, we do work again closely with several clinics, and we are committed to being an extension of your clinic's care team. Our quality and our commitment to donor quality and excellence makes us the premier, yet one of the most cost-effective solutions for donor egg recipients. We do have one of the strongest embryo development guarantees available in the industry, and that is included with the cost of a cohort. So, to begin your search of finding a donor, you will log on to our website, which is fairfaxeggbank.com. There you will register as a new user and will sign a confidentiality agreement form, and that will grant you free access to our large, expansive donor database of pre-selected FDA-compliant donors. This registration, again, is free and it is unlimited. The donor profiles will include the donor's medical history across 3 generations, childhood and adult photos, and some of our donors have audio interviews and personal essays. And once you are registered on our website, a member of the client relations team will be contacting you to start your process to secure your donor. The next step, once you're prepared to reserve a donor cohort, is that you will be in contact with the client relations team. You will let the client relations team know which donor you would like to proceed with, and the client relations specialist will place a hold on the number of cohorts that you wish to purchase, and that hold period is complimentary for 2 business days. During that 2 business day time period, we are going to be asking you to complete a series of documents. The first and most important document is our Terms of Use Agreement, which is a legal document outlining the utilization of frozen donor eggs from Fairfax EggBank. In addition, if you do select a carrier donor, there is additional paperwork, which I will review shortly. And once we have that paperwork back within 2 business days, we will initiate what we call our donor match confirmation. The donor match confirmation is a singular document which allows you as the recipient, Fairfax EggBank, and your clinic to all be on one accord of the donor that you wish to move forward with. Once we have the signed donor match confirmation back from your clinic and from you, you will remit payment to Fairfax EggBank or to your clinic for the cohorts that you wish to purchase. This does happen even if you are selecting a carrier donor, because the additional genetic testing that may need to take place can be done in parallel. And the cohort will remain in storage for up to 90 days, complimentary, but beyond that, if you so choose, after you have purchased the cohort. So let me review the genetic acknowledgement form. The genetic acknowledgement form is a document that you will need to read over carefully and sign, and it just ensures that you understand the donor's genetic testing results and that you can discuss these with your clinic. It will also indicate if there is additional genetic testing that needs to be done on your sperm source, and if the sperm source is negative, there is a reduced risk of an affected child, but that risk is never 0. Another important point is that if both biological parents are carriers of the same condition, there is an increased risk of a child being affected with that genetic condition, and that genetic counseling should be sought out if you so desire. Finally, and very important, is this step in this condition. If you are found that if it is found that this donor is not a genetically suitable match, you will be eligible to either exchange this donor for another donor that is a suitable match, or if you cannot find a suitable donor, you would be eligible for a full refund under the guise of this being a non-suitable genetic match, and this happens within 60 days of completed testing. Please note that if the cohort does ship to your clinic, it is considered a final, and that the cohort cannot be returned back to Fairfax EggBank, or no refunds will be issued at that point. Okay, and so in the event that you need to have your sperm source undergo genetic testing, it is possible that you can continue to look for a search for a donor, even if that donor is a healthy carrier. Everyone at Fairfax EggBank is invested in making sure that any identified risks are reduced as much as possible. If your sperm source hasn't been tested, then you will need to consider testing. And if additional testing is recommended for the donor, we will make every effort to reach out to the donor to request that this testing be done. Please note that there will be additional fees that will apply, and those are paid by the intended parent. And last, the finalization of your process. If you have a genetically suitable match, this means that if your sperm source is a known carrier of a condition and the egg donor that you have chosen, it has tested negative for the same condition, or if the egg donor you've chosen is a known carrier and your sperm source tests negative for that same condition, or both your sperm source and the donor are found to not be known carriers, then it is okay to move forward with this match, and we will coordinate the shipping process with your clinic so that you can proceed. Again, your cohort can remain in storage at Fairfax EggBank, and the first 90 days of that storage is complimentary. So there is absolute flexibility in you planning your next steps. If it is found that there is a genetic unsuitable match, which means your sperm source and the egg donor both have tested as a carrier for the same condition, then again, we have a couple of options available for you. Again, you will have already secured the donor, and if it is deemed to not be a suitable match, then you can either exchange the donor for another donor that is a genetically suitable match, or receive a full refund if you cannot move forward. Suzanne?
All right, well, let's wrap up here. So I think the big takeaways here is being a carrier is a normal part of being a human being. Most of us who have this testing done find out we're carriers. So now that we're using donor gametes, or donor eggs in this case, it is important for us to recognize that that means we need to make sure our sperm source and our egg donor are not carriers for the same thing. And that's how we reduce risk and make the chances of a healthy outcome increase. And our Fairfax Egg Donor Database has very detailed information that you can use as you look for the appropriate donor. Those with expanded panel testing are called our GenPanel Plus donors. You can see them with the double helix. If they have the C in their ID number, that means they're a carrier. You can find out more information on their medical profile, or also on the genetic testing summary, which you could request. And it is very important that once you find that ideal donor, that we now know all the steps to take to reserve that cohort and to finalize it and get on with shipping it and having that baby we want. So what I wanted to do now is to redo the poll and see if those of you who have listened to this for the last 30 minutes feel like you've perhaps gotten a little bit more educated. So pick it again. Not familiar at all. I know a little bit. I know a lot. I am an expert. What does it look like? Can you give us that spread, that nice little bar graph? I love bar graphs. Oh, great. You know, it looks like the majority of you did move up a bit, so I'm very happy to see that. And I've even gotten a few more experts, so that's great. So now we've entered our Q&A session, and I do believe we were getting questions coming in right from the beginning. So Teri and I are going to be able to answer those for the next 30 minutes or so.
one of the first questions is, how does age affect the genetic results?
How does age affect the genetic results? So, one of the reasons that we select our egg donors in a specific age range is because we do recognize that as women age, their ovarian reserve does decrease. So we do have a limit on that. So we are looking at the younger women with normal ovarian reserve. Women who are older, and typically that's 35 years or older, do find themselves in what we call the advanced maternal age category. The concern there is that the eggs in their ovaries have been there since they were in the womb, since they were a fetus. As they get older, the process that happens at ovulation becomes a little less efficient. So chromosomes don't align correctly, and so eggs can have either too much or too little chromosome material in them, and that does increase, that chance of that happening does increase with age.
You mentioned earlier the lab. Can you repeat the name of the lab that you use?
We use Semaphore, which is based out of Mount Sinai. We've been very happy with the quality of their work, and they do 283 conditions. There are other labs that we're very familiar with too, Horizon, Myriad, and so we are very comfortable looking at results from your sperm source in all the different testing labs, assessing whether the test was done to the current standard. Some people have had testing done several years ago and don't realize that things have improved dramatically, and we may make the recommendation to get the current test with the better detection rates. So we'll do that evaluation at the time of the suitability match.
One question just came in. If I am making inquiries about a donor during my selection process, will I get this amount of details about the egg donor?
If
I'm making inquiries about a donor during my selection process.
Well, I mean, the good news is that a lot of this information is already available on the donor search. So if you see that she's an expanded panel donor, by default, she's had 283 conditions tested. You can see on her medical profile exactly what she's a carrier for, the condition name and the gene name. And that's really the nugget of information you need to be able to match to your sperm source. The genetic testing summary that I showed you is available on request. If you're working with your client relations specialist, they have access to that information. It can give you helpful information about the condition. If you have questions about what it means, what is this disease? So more details are there as well.
Does the donor find out if a cohort is chosen?
No, this is Teri answering that question. No, the donor is not informed if a cohort or her eggs have been used.
The other question about the lab was, how long does it take to get the results back?
So let's say we have some additional testing to do either on the sperm source or the egg donor. Typically, once a sample is collected and submitted to the lab, it's about 2 weeks to get a result back. And I also want to note that it is possible for the labs to send kits directly. Many of these labs will do this. Semaphore does. Send the kits directly to your home, and their self-collection, they will be able to do the DNA test on a saliva sample. So they send you a tube with instructions. You spit into the tube. It's quite a bit, so it can take a while. But you cap it and you put it back into the FedEx box and ship it back to them. So you don't even actually have to go in for a blood draw. So that does make it easier, and that's something that might make it easier for the sperm source to be tested as well.
Teri, this is a question for you. If the egg is shipped and it does not marry with the donor sperm, is it not eligible for a replacement?
Right. So to answer that question, it's a little bit twofold. So we will not ship a cohort of eggs that is not a genetically suitable match. So we will ensure genetic suitability prior to the shipment. To answer the second part of the question, our embryo development guarantee is related to the development of the embryos. In the event that the development does not occur and there are specific conditions that need to be met, then the cohort would be eligible for a replacement review. If that replacement review is granted, then you would receive a full replacement cohort at no cost. I hope that that answers the question.
Okay. Here's one. Does the person seeking an egg donor need to do a genetic test for you to be able to do a genetic matching? If yes, will you be the one to conduct the genetic testing for my husband?
So typically the clinic where you all are already patients is the place where you all receive your testing. Your clinic will have a relationship with the lab, and so usually they will just do that as part of their intake process, offer you the option for the expanded panel at that point. I can certainly help your clinic facilitate getting that testing done, but it is, you know, it's very important that when those results come back, that you have access to appropriate follow-up, and that's obviously best done with your clinician. The labs often have genetic counseling services available, so if a result comes back that you're a carrier for something, the lab that presented that result to you will often be available on an on-call basis to answer questions about what those results mean. I can help facilitate getting that done, but I wouldn't be the one sending the kits and talking to you directly, but I can certainly help. I talk to lots of the clinic coordinators about what needs to be tested. Are these results a good match? I certainly help.
Should I have my husband tested before we pick a donor?
You know, the ideal time to get that expanded panel testing is before you start the process, because then it just lets you move through, make a choice, and get that cohort shipped and start your cycle. It is something certainly to address with your clinicians. But if you haven't had it done yet, that's not a reason not to look at our donor list, because frankly, you might find a donor that you like and now you're ready to start. And then again, it's just about a 2-week wait for results once he gets tested.
What test should we ask for genetic panel for sperm source? I have a LabCorp close to me. Do they do it? Do I need to ask my physician to prescribe a lab order?
So, you know, the labs will have these test menus where you can check off anything from 15 diseases to 17 diseases to 300 diseases to 500 diseases, and they're not all the same, clearly, because they test for a different number of conditions. So the carrier panels run between 175 and 300 diseases, and so that's the one you would need to look at. LabCorp does a fine one, but these do require physician orders. They're typically not tests that are client ordered. So that is something to consider. So I would work with your clinic, and they typically have relationships with labs where they have electronic databases that communicate, and individuals that know how to, they have the kits on site because they need the box with the shipping labels and the tubes. All of that's on site there already. So my guess is your clinic has already got this set up and is already doing it.
Is there an age restriction to implant an egg from a donor?
I'm not sure I have the answer to that. Teri, is there an age restriction?
That is clinic by clinic decision.
Yeah.
Okay. And does Fairfax have an age limit for egg donors?
Yes, we do. I believe that it is 32 years old
It's
on her first cycle.
19 to 30. 19 to 30.
19 to 30, excuse me, 19 to 30.
Should the blood type of the donor egg match mine?
You know, blood type is an interesting thing because if it depends on what your intent is as well in telling your child if they're donor conceived. So if you want it to appear as if you could have been the biological mother, then a match would potentially be important. The other factor to consider is RH negative and positive, so that your doctor may have specific recommendations based on your Rh status, which is the plus or minus in your blood type. If you should pick a donor that's of a specific blood type, and that has to do with health concerns in the developing baby. So one would be to match it for the convenience, and the second would be for health concerns, and that would be a clinician's concern to address with you.
What does the D after the donor number indicate? The ID in the donor number is whether or not they are an ID donor. Teri, do you want to talk about that?
Certainly. So the ID, which is the 2 letters that are after the donor number, indicates that this donor is in our ID option program. That means that she has elected to be contacted by any resulting offspring once that child becomes of age. You, as the parent, must register the birth of the child with Fairfax EggBank. And again, this contact information that we will have on the donor is given to the child only once the child comes of age. If you do not register the birth, then the child will not have access to this information. And this is unilateral, meaning that the donor will not have any information about any resulting children.
How many times is a donor egg used in our lifespan? I think that how many times is a donor able to donate in our lifespan is probably a better way to phrase that.
Okay, yep, that's a great question. So a donor is eligible to cycle up to 6 times in her lifetime per ASRM guidelines, which is the Society of Reproductive Medicine. This is, again, 6 cycles in her lifetime.
What is the risk of using a donor who has not completed expanded genetic testing?
So actually, that is a really key question, because if your sperm source has had expanded panel testing and we know that he is negative for almost all of them, then the result on the egg donor side becomes not relevant, in the sense that if he's already tested negative for cystic fibrosis, let's say, then it's the biological parents both have to be carriers in order for a child to be affected. So if we already know that one side of the equation is negative, the other side doesn't need to be addressed, because even if they're positive, it would be considered a suitable match. So as long as one person has had expanded panel testing in the match, that's all we need. But the key thing is, if you are a carrier, it then becomes important to go back and make sure that the other side of the equation has tested negative. So if we have a plus on one side, we have to make sure the other side is negative. But if we already have a negative, the other side doesn't need to be tested. So it's not that important, frankly, unless we have to address those that are positive.
What do we do if there's no genetic counselor at my clinic?
So most of the clinics do have resources available, either a genetic counselor that's on staff with the hospital or the clinic, or they register with a service that like a call-in telemedicine service, which have actually become even more popular recently. But we have a genetics team here, a medical geneticist who I work with very closely. And we obviously want to get your questions answered. A lot of times it's a matter of just reviewing those genetic results to make sure that the testing's been completed and it's negative where it needs to be negative. And that part I can certainly do. And I do want to make myself available, but work through your client relations specialist, because they've all been trained as well to answer some of the common questions that we get, and use me as a resource all the time. So we are a team here. We will get those questions answered for you.
So here's a good question for both of you. So should her husband be tested before they can purchase?
That's actually not critical to reserve the cohort. If you found an egg donor that you like, he does not need to be tested as a requirement to reserve the cohort. I mean, you found the donor that you like, he can be tested for the specific disease that has to be tested if there's that concern. So, and Teri that's probably right. Yes, he can be tested after.
That's correct. That's correct.
I mean, we want you to be able to look at all the donors because, you know, that it is hard enough to find a donor that matches on the criteria that matter to you. And it would be a shame if you excluded donors that you could make suitable simply by waiting an additional week or two for results.
Teri, this is for you. When you're looking for a donor, can you send your baby photos to your specialist to help find a match?
Absolutely. We have that happen quite often. Intended parents will send baby pictures or adult photos, and our client relations team will work very hard to send donors your way that they believe may be a match for you, and you can certainly go from there.
And this one is pertaining more to the clinics, I think, but also to the donors. Now that we're in this pandemic, is it safe to move forward doing donor egg, doing any IVF?
Well, Teri, why don't you address that from the clinic's perspective?
So from the donor and the clinic perspective, many of our donors have eggs that have been retrieved prior to COVID, and we are doing testing for any new retrievals to ensure safety. From the clinic perspective, it's definitely worth a conversation with your clinic on how they are choosing to proceed with cycle management during COVID. But many of our clinics are operating at full capacity to their pre-COVID state, if I could say that, and are accepting shipments quite regularly. And intended parents are very excited about moving forward. And in addition, one of the advantages, of course, with frozen donor egg is you know that the eggs are ready to go when you are ready to go. So you won't have to worry, or you won't have to wait for a donor to cycle in order to begin your process of building your family.
So we have lots of similar questions on here that have been answered, but we will be creating a blog with any questions we did not answer today. We will also be making this webinar available after today's session. It will be sent out to all of the attendees. Be patient. We want to make sure it's in good shape. And I just want to say a final thank you to both Suzanne and to Teri for today. Any follow-up questions or any follow-up words?
Well, I'm certainly thrilled you guys were able to be here. This is a complex topic. It can often be very overwhelming to read through all the details of this, but hopefully we've simplified it for you some today, and it isn't quite as overwhelming. And there's a good donor out there for you.
And I'd like to add that when you do register on our website, please be sure to indicate the clinic that you're working with so that you will be in touch with your clinic's lead client relations specialist, who again will help you every step of the way. We look forward to working with you.